So then what you don't know, what you've never been told, is that there is a black Rolls Royce parked there. You look at the pictures, you won't see it. But the police found a black Rolls Royce and they traced it to the name.
All right, we are back again with Nikolas Schreck. How are you doing, Nikolas?
Good to see you again.
Good to see you, and I'm delighted to have you back. You have so much information that we were kind of just starting to scratch the surface last time. And
Just the tip of the dark iceberg, so we
yeah.
can go even further.
Oh, for sure. And okay, the one thing that I didn't bring up last time, because it wasn't specific to Manson, was you are related to somebody I've actually done a show with on another channel, a show on, I should say, another channel, Anton Leclerc. You were once married into his family, I believe.
Yes, I was married to Zena LeVay, his daughter, who's now Zena Schreck, and she was the high priestess of the Church of Satan. I befriended him while researching a book called The Demonic Revolution in 1988 and got to know him and interviewed him. I fell in love with Zena, his daughter. We got involved and we had a very acrimonious breaking up with Anton. Zena left the Church of Satan, denounced him as a fraud and charlatan, and we have been, the enemy of the Church of Satan ever since, and we have very vociferously denounced Satanism.
You have to understand, growing up in this religion, I almost began to regard it as a kind of problem sibling. It was like my brother. It was under attack when all of these horrendous accusations were happening. And I called my father and I asked him what his media strategy was to deal with it, and he confessed that he had no media strategy whatsoever. He didn't care. At that point, he was living in a complete isolated bubble. My mother had left him. So I said, well, if you need anybody to answer questions or just to answer a phone call or something, I said, I can do it. From there, I became the high priestess of the Church of Satan.
But yes, for a few years, I was associated with him as his friend. I was made an honorary member of the Church of Satan. I never particularly believed or espoused its atheistic viewpoint. I had a much more metaphysical understanding of that subject. But yeah, but it's related tangentially to the Manson research in that Kenneth Anger, who was one of Anton LaVey's best friends, the filmmaker, had a crush on the young musician Bobby Beausoleil, who he cast in the role of Lucifer in this long-running film project, Lucifer Rising, that Kenneth Anger made. And Bobby Beausoleil appeared with Anton LaVey in an early version of Lucifer Rising that Kenneth Anger eventually edited a little bit of it together as his film. Bobby Beausoleil met Anton LaVey on the set of the film that became Invocation of My Demon Brother from 1969. So that was one connection, and that was before Bobby Beausoleil met Charlie in Los Angeles. That was filmed in San Francisco in 1967. And the other connection between the Church of Satan, although it's very tangential and people have made far more of it than it's really worth, is that Susan Atkins was briefly employed by Anton LaVey as a stripper. She played a vampire in something called the Topless Witches Review at a strip club in San Francisco that Anton organized.
At 21, Susan Atkins would become the most visible member of a ragtag bunch of killers, the Manson family. A one-time nice little kid as she grew up in Northern California, Susan became a popular babysitter, captained her school swimming team, and sang in the church choir.
And, but conspiracy theorists and maniacs in general have expounded upon these things, overthought it far more deeply than it deserves. But there were these tangential connections in 1967 before Susan Atkins and before Bobby Beausoleil got involved with Manson's commune.
Okay, a couple things. One thing when we did the Anton Leclerc show or whatever, covering him, what we kind of discovered or felt was he was sort of full of shit. And what by that I mean he really wasn't worshiping Satan. He was kind of a con man, similar to L. Ron Hubbard created his own religion.
He was a low budget L. Ron Hubbard. Now, he never said that he worshiped Satan. He always maintained that he was an atheist and that he was using Satan as a symbol. But the fact is, he invented most of his biography. He didn't know Marilyn Monroe. He was not the technical advisor of Rosemary's Baby, nor did he appear as the devil in it.
How about Mansfield, Jane Mansfield? Did he know her?
He knew Jane Mansfield through a little publicity photograph opportunity that her agent set up, but they were not romantically involved. She was not deeply, it was very superficial. So I interviewed him at great length, and he was a habitual liar and like a Baron Munchausen syndrome. And for people that don't know, who are aware, of my ancient interviews about these subjects, they may not be aware that I have denounced Satanism entirely, decades ago. But the relation particularly to the subject we're discussing, the Tate LaBianca murders and the whole Manson phenomenon, Bobby Beausoleil knew Kenneth Anger, and he appeared in this film with Anton LaVey, Invocation of My Demon Brother, which I'm sure you could find. Bobby Beausoleil didn't like Anton. He called them the plastic devil. He thought he was a phony. And Susan Atkins was only involved in she came over to Anton's Black House a few times. A few pictures of her were taken for nudie magazines of the time, which is where most of the publicity of the Church of Satan was. And she appeared in this Topless Witches review. And the first time that these pictures of her dressed as a vampire on acid during this Topless Witches review coming out of a coffin was shown in my film Charles Manson Superstar. Anton actually gave me some photographs from that. But that's the extent of it. People who would like to believe that there's some occult dimension to this make a lot more of those tangential connections in San Francisco than I think are really important.
Well, and you bring up a good point, and we've talked offline, and I talked to other people who do true crime. Manny Grossman, who actually introduced you and I, he's been a repeat customer here, or I don't know how you put it, but a repeat guest. He's a good guy, studies a lot. I've also talked to some people about D.B. Cooper. I've talked to people about Zodiac, and also O.J. Simpson. I've got a couple videos of O.J. Simpson that are completely, they're bonkers and two completely different theories. But one thing I found in the whole, I'm going to say true crime genre or whatever, is that I'm not trying to be rude, but people are crazy.
My experience, particularly in the Manson research milieu, there is almost a metaphysical insanity that comes over people involved with this. And they can be intelligent and ethical people to begin with, but they become obsessed. And you use the proper word. They go crazy. They absolutely do. And I've seen this happen with many of the researchers who go down the rabbit hole of the Tate LaBianca mystery. If they don't have some kind of sound spiritual tradition, if they don't have some ethical code, they go off the rails. And I have seen psychotic breaks. I have seen paranoia on the extreme level. And I do believe that there is something genuinely malevolent on a metaphysical level with this subject that makes people crack up. And I feel like I almost have to warn people, if you look into this, do it carefully.
Nietzsche.
and keep a grip on your reason and rationality, because there are psychotic feuds between people that disagree about various theories of the murders, and people that are obsessed with the various characters and figures in the saga. And it leads to very destructive mental illness. There's no other way to put it. And I think any of us who have looked into this field have encountered that.
When you say that, it makes me think of Friedrich Nietzsche's, careful when looking into the abyss, or the abyss is going to look into you.
I've often quoted that in regard to this phenomenon.
Okay. My theory is, and I don't know if this is right or not, but I feel like some people want to own these crimes or something. I don't know how to explain it. It's like they're so deeply invested in a theory. It's almost like they're claiming ownership, and these are actually monstrous crimes.
Yeah, I agree with you absolutely. A lot of people want to be, they want to corner the market on being the Son of Sam expert, the Manson expert, the Jack the Ripper expert. And you see this as well in, which is maybe America's greatest true crime, the JFK assassination.
Oh, God.
People obsessed with
I
that
covered
field.
that too.
I'm surprised that there hasn't been another assassination of rival researchers in that field, because
That one actually goes wider, because there is definite CIA involvement in
right.
that, and it's actually a great case to compare, because with JFK, there's actual national considerations. We are talking about the president. You're talking about
Right.
Very senior figures and government documents that have been deliberately suppressed, hidden, still not released.
Right.
And the CIA and others are happy to stoke on all the controversy and the battles, because the more noise, the more confusion that's out there.
We know now that even in 1964, the CIA were deliberately spreading false rumors about their own involvement, but misleading rumors, and they're very good at. I mean, that's a well-known intelligence technique to distract and misdirect the public by saying, yes, the CIA had something to do with it, by putting some ridiculous dead end of a theory that doesn't lead to the actual truth. And they definitely have done that.
Yes, and I can tell you firsthand, it's very frustrating, because if you cover it and you try to research it, people have their little pet things. And some of these pet things have been disproven for a long time, like 20 years, 30 years, whatever. And you say, hey, it's disproven. Here's the evidence, whatever. Oh, no, you know what you're talking about. They're going to come back at you. And it just escalates.
In the microcosm of the Manson milieu, there are still true believers in Helter Skelter, though Bugliosi's fraudulent theory has been almost thoroughly debunked, but they hang on to it like with religious devotion. They've invested so much time into this narrative, they stick to it. And exactly like the CIA or the Mafia or Castro with the JFK case, people are diehard believers in their theories about the Tate LaBianca murders, and they threaten each other. And there are death threats about this. They become so invested in it that they lose sight of reality, and it's very difficult to even talk about these things in a sober historical manner without a kind of hysteria and hatred and vitriol becoming part of it. And that's very rarely addressed, but I think it's an odd and consequential side effect of this phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, okay, this is my advice to the public. One thing I deliberately do on Twitter and social feeds is I subscribe to silly stuff, ridiculous things. I like having dumb cat videos appearing in between other things, because I feel like you can get caught up into complete toxicity when you are looking into true crime or whatever. And it's good to have some palate cleansers and other things that are just dumb, just funny, just goofy.
No, actually, it's funny you say that. Before I went on to this interview, I was saying to an associate here that I should take a lighter tone with this thing to try to calm people down, because the more serious you are about it, the more serious they get, and the more intense they get about it. So yes, if you don't look at even the tragic things happening in this world with a sense of absurdity and a sense of humor, it can lead to this kind of uptight, paranoid, intense, obsessive attitude. So I fully agree with you. We need to have a lighter touch, even about dark, tragic matters, or people uh, get so serious that they start to lose perspective on reality.
Okay, that leads to one more question, and this came up a lot in the comments. And you lost your ear somehow in this whole mix of things. Is this
I
related?
didn't lose it. It was removed for me. I didn't
Okay.
lose it.
Well, what happened?
Yeah, I have told this story before, and I'll keep this within the parameters of that incident's connection to the whole Manson phenomenon, because indeed there was a direct connection. On August 1 or 2, 1987, around midnight, a friend of mine, a former friend of mine, invited me to a comedy show in West Hollywood. And the comedian that was going to appear and me went off to go to this comedy show. And on the way to it, this former ex erstwhile friend of mine was a cartoonist, and he made extremely racist, obscene, deliberately offensive cartoons. He eventually went on to become A. Wyatt Mann, and if you look, that's his pseudonym. If you look him up on the internet, he is the darling of right wing, groups because of his extremely racist hate cartoons. Is the only way you can put it. So he was extremely anti-gay, and on this night was shown the first TV movie during the Reagan era that addressed the AIDS phenomenon, if you're following me so far. And he made these cartoons on pink paper that he wanted to go to the gay part of West Hollywood, which is called Boys Town, on the night that this very tear-jerking, sensitive TV movie about AIDS was on. And he wanted to put these very offensive anti-AIDS flyers on people's windshield wipers so that they would find them in the morning after seeing the show. So this was not the comedian or I had nothing to do with this, but we stupidly went along with him because he was driving to the show. So it's late at night in West Hollywood. We got out of the car. He put these flyers on a few cars on a street in West Hollywood, not far from this comedy nightclub. And that was it. It was his idea of some kind of malicious prank. That was the kind of person he was. We get into the car, and the car begins swaying like that because four very large people, apparently like muscle, men, people like gay guys who had worked out a lot. They looked like they'd just come from the gym or something and had found this very offensive anti-AIDS thing that this guy Nick Bugis or A. Wyatt Mann had left, and they were angry and they were moving his car like back and forth like they wanted to overturn it. Well, apparently, when I had gotten into the passenger seat, one of them had cut my ear with an extremely sharp razor because there was no pain. I didn't even notice it, and it had to be in the interim of the car door opening and closing, and I didn't notice it. But we looked at each other like we're probably going to be killed now because that's how aggressive these people were in trying to overturn the car and get us out of it or whatever. And I will never forget, he pushed the gas pedal and it wouldn't move and we're stuck there. And we really thought, okay, the walls are closing in here. And then for some reason it did work and it sped off, and these four guys were thrown to the side by the momentum of the car moving. I can remember that very vividly. And then I became very giddy, I almost like in a very good mood, because I went into shock. When you're losing blood, your body produces endorphins and happiness hormones to kind of keep you up when you're in shock because you're losing blood. So I was giddy and in a strangely high kind of mood. And then my friend said, "There's blood all over your shirt," and it was a black shirt like this, but
So
actually
you
you
don't
could
see it
see.
as immediately.
If you've ever seen a bullfight, you see the blood on a bull.
Mm.
It looked like that much,
Wow.
and and then I felt that the ear was gone, totally clean cut with a razor that must have been incredibly sharp to not have any pain. Um, so I had the presence of mind to say, take me to the hospital, and I knew where there was one, and we went to the hospital. And I've related these things before, but this was a very surreal California incident of violence. And I told my friend, keeping to the kind of criminal code that I then followed, I said, "Don't say anything about this. I won't involve you. I won't snitch about it. Just drop me off, and I'll never mention that you were involved, and let it let it be a mystery." But he didn't. He went and gossiped to people all over about it immediately. So, in either case, in any event, I entered the hospital, and this is so Hollywood. A documentary filmmaker like myself came up with a microphone and with a camera crew and said, "Oh, we're making a documentary about violent crime. Would you talk to us?" And I'm bleeding all over the place. I need to be attended to immediately, and that's just so Los Angeles, like reality show, always the Truman Show. And then the nurse, who was the admitting nurse, said, "Have you ever seen the movie Blue Velvet?" And I don't, maybe some of your listeners will recall that Blue Velvet, David Lynch's movie, begins with a severed ear on a suburban lawn with an ant crawling on it. So I said, "Yeah, I've seen the movie. Are you going to attend to this wound?" And then, and then there was the surreal experience of the doctor talking on a walkie-talkie to the LAPD where the incident occurred. The LAPD had located the ear in the street and said, "All right, we're bringing the ear now," and then they rush and I see my own severed ear. And the doctor looked at it and he said, "It's already developing necrosis, which means the cells are dying." So he could have, Frankenstein like stitched it back, but it was already dying, and he couldn't do anything with it. And yeah, and then now, as a prelude to this, I have to point out that that day I was working on the first edition of the Manson file in 1987. It came out in 1988, and what I was working on was there's a people who know the case will know this drawing that the police did of Gary Hinman, one of the victims. His wound was here. Manson cut him with a cutlass on his ear very badly. And that's what I had been working on that day. And for some reason, the ancient device of a Xerox machine, which probably some of your or listeners have never even heard of, kept malfunctioning about showing this. So when this incident happened, I was very conscious that I'd been looking at the ear wound of Gary Hinman. So I feel it was connected in some bizarre karmic way. And then the final coup de grace that connected it to the Manson thing was that when I was entered into the hospital room for overnight monitoring, a woman from the Doris Tate Commission for Violent Crime came into the room and said, "You're liable for a certain amount of money," because Doris Tate had put aside funds for people who were victims. And at that moment, as I've said before, I felt like my friendship with Manson, I didn't want to take money from Sharon Tate's mother, so I didn't sign up for that program. But to me, the whole thing was definitely connected to the intrinsic darkness and danger of even looking into this thing. I believe it was a kind of karmic repercussion of my looking into it. And when you have Gary Hinman, a Buddhist whose ear was cut, and here I am, a Buddhist with my ear cut. So, and then the Doris Tate connection.
So you were already shifting to be a Buddhist at that point, or did that encourage you to
Oh
shift?
no, I wasn't then. At that time, I was very thoroughly a prominent devil worshiper. Not at that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So did that
And
lead
Charlie,
into your change over time, or did it help precipitate?
not really. I can't say that it did particularly. I mean, maybe it was part of the process,
Mhm.
but no pun intended. Not the process church of the final
They keep
judgment.
coming up, don't they?
Yes, they do, all too much. And like whack-a-mole, we have to keep putting them down.
Somebody actually
So,
clipped the section of the last video, by the way, where you mentioned the
right.
process. And they clipped 18 seconds of it because YouTube, you can do clipping. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And it was essentially saying, yeah, it's all part of the process. And
Right.
you were saying, but not the process. And anyway, that
No,
was
you
what they
have
clipped
to.
out. So,
There was a researcher into the Manson case named Bill Nelson in the 80s, and he was convinced, although he met me many times, that because I denied that the Process Church was involved in the Tate LaBianca murders or Manson, he was friendly to me, but he was convinced that I am a member of the process who is saying that because I'm covering up their involvement. And you can't win with people who believe firmly in these conspiracies, just as some people who are ardent advocates of Tom O'Neill's CIA theory, which I thoroughly discount. Some people said, "Oh, Shrek works for the CIA. He's trying to cover up."
well, and that's what I did want to shift to is some of the other characters. Like we spent some time talking about Charles Manson, a little bit on Tex Watson last time. Um, Susan Atkins, other than the added information about doing the stripping with Anton Leclerc, was there any more to her story?
She would be given immunity or a lesser sentence if she would confess and tell a false confession about what the crimes were about. She spoke to several women in other prisoners in the women's prison or jail where she was. And finally, the person who I believe was a plant, because this woman, Virginia Graham, is who Susan Atkins spoke to, knew Jay Sebring. The woman that Susan Atkins confessed to was a friend of Jay Sebring. She knew Frank Sinatra, a lover of Frank Sinatra. She had known Ronald Reagan in her youth, and she had even once considered renting Cielo Drive.
And Susan met her in the can. She was locked up.
Accidentally, Virginia Graham was another prisoner in the can who was there, and she was a prostitute and a madam connected to many mafia figures, and she knew Jay Sebring. And people don't think it's suspicious that this was the woman that Susan supposedly confessed to. So that's one part of it. And then a very mysterious figure named Lawrence Schiller, who you may know from the Kennedy mess. He was one of the most ardent critics of the Warren and one of the ardent critics of the conspiracy, the idea that Oswald did not act alone. Lawrence Schiller was a journalist
filmmaker, right? He was a filmmaker, and he worked with
Norman Mailer.
If I got it right,
Yeah.
Norman Mailer.
Yeah.
Yes, he worked with Norman Mailer, and now you're throwing another tie in there, by the way, because Vincent Bugliosi wrote Reclaiming History, so he did two major books, Helter Skelter and both piles of garbage.
There's a direct connection there, which I think if your listeners understand who Lawrence Schiller is and how much involved he was with the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination, his involvement in the cover-up of the Tate LaBianca thing, and what you just mentioned, that Bugliosi made his life's work writing this book denying that there was a conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy, put two and two together about what Vincent Bugliosi's role in this whole thing was. And there is, and I did this for a magazine article several years ago, there are direct connections between the cover-up of the Cielo Drive murders and the Kennedy assassination. And Vincent Bugliosi and Lawrence Schiller are some of the main figures involved in trying to cover up both of them. So
what is their actual connection, though? I mean, the same people are involved in driving the narrative. I'll just say driving the narrative versus covering up, whatever. Is there a direct connection between JFK and Manson, or is it they just happen to hire the same
No, no.
people
The
to
direct
do
connection,
a
I
narrative?
believe, first of all, is that Bugliosi and Schiller were, I believe, assigned to cover up the drug dealing and mafia connections of the narcotics trafficking and porno ring that was really going on at Cielo Drive and in this whole criminal network, just exactly as they covered up the mob involvement in the JFK assassination. A direct connection. You know who David Atlee Phillips is, I'm sure. Vincent Bugliosi was hired to do he was hired by a British TV company to do a trial of Oswald, an entertainment TV show in which he would be.
Yes, with Jerry Spence
Yes,
with him.
exactly. That's correct. Before he did it, David Atlee Phillips wrote to Vincent Bugliosi, and a researcher found this letter. And David Atlee Phillips, who, as you know, some people believe actually was Maurice
CIA.
Bishop, who was probably Lee Harvey Oswald's handler in the Central Intelligence Agency, was working with Bugliosi to help him cover up he wrote this very angry letter. We have to stop, these lies about a conspiracy. So you put two and two together there. Secondly, Jay Sebring knew he had cut John F. Kennedy's hair. Virginia Graham, the woman who Susan Atkins confessed to, told me that. That's how well she knew Jay Sebring. So there's something very fishy. You asked about Susan Atkins, very fishy about her confession, which is clearly a contrived cover-up. So Lawrence Schiller, who if your listeners look him up, you will see his whole career as ambulance chasing after every famous case. Gary Gilmore, O.J. Simpson, JonBenet Ramsey. And he's always right there. He's like the Zelig of murder. He's always right there. And he put together this book, The Killing of Sharon Tate, which put across the idea to the general public and was sold to newspapers all over the world that these were weird, random hippie killings ordered by Charles Manson, and essentially they cover up what the murders were really about, which it was a drug dealing dispute. So, I would recommend that people look into the figure of Lawrence Schiller. So so Susan Atkins revealed the crime, but she also concealed the crime by presenting a false narrative of what happened. And that false narrative is what Bugliosi built on. Her lawyers, Caruso and Caballero, Paul Caruso was connected to Frankie Carbo, a mob figure who was Charlie Manson's mentor in prison and one of his main connections to the Cosa Nostra. He knew Sidney Korshak, who was a mob lawyer who directly helped Roman Polanski and Robert Evans cover up the Tate LaBianca murder. So it's very murky. And from the beginning of Susan Atkins' public, the awareness of the public of this young woman, she was totally embroiled with these mafia figures who had every reason to be covering up. Why would this penniless hippie girl have a guy like Paul Caruso, who was, the lawyer that the mob went to be her defense?
Okay, so now that's even more on her and Jay Sebring. Now, Jay Sebring, his names come in and out as we've been talking here. And from what I understand, Jay Sebring was the hairdresser to the stars and potentially was also their drug dealer.
He was the hairdresser hyphen drug dealer to the stars. And this was recently confirmed to me by an employee of Sebring International, who, without any ambiguity, admitted that Jay Sebring was known to be a drug dealer, that the crimes were definitely connected to his narcotics trafficking, not helter-skelter, not CIA, absolutely. She knew her father, who was a friend of Sebring, and this interview will be included in a documentary that I'm here in Los Angeles making right now. So, my detractors can no longer say that, I'm victim blaming or being a Manson apologist. This is a direct admission from a member of Sebring International, one of the last people who knows how to do Sebring's copyrighted haircutting technique, that Jay Sebring was a drug dealer and that his death was the result of his narcotics trafficking. So that's, I've known that for years, but this is from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and it will be included in my upcoming documentary. And doing some research on the Mafia connections between Jay Sebring and organized crime, and looking into the Mafia figure Charlie Barron, who was known as Charlie the General Barron. And a very suspicious moment in the whole Manson saga, the day after Jay Sebring was killed at Cielo Drive, Charlie Barron, who knew Frank Costello, who knew Frankie Carbo, who knew all of these Mafia figures and was a hitman directly connected to organized crime, and was a very good friend of Jay Sebring and a client. He cut his hair in Las Vegas. Charlie Barron, this gangster, called from Las Vegas to a barber at Sebring International named Joe Torreneva, and he told him right after the murders, when no one had any idea what that was about, he said, "Joe, don't worry, nothing will happen to you. You haven't done anything." So that opens a whole can of worms and rabbit hole that make it clear there's much more to this crime than what we have been told. So that was something I've been looking into recently, are the direct mob connections between Jay Sebring and the underworld. Another factor I should mention in that context, Bugsy Siegel, who I'm sure some of your people who know about mob history and American history will know was a major figure in the Mafia in the 30s and 40s, and who was killed in 1947 by his own people. The criminal background of the Tate LaBianca murders goes back that far to 1947 and the murder of Bugsy Siegel, because Bugsy Siegel was killed by Frankie Carbo, who was a Mafia figure that Manson befriended in prison, and Frankie Carbo became Charlie's Mafia mentor, someone he greatly admired and learned the ropes of the underworld from. Some people have associated Frankie Carbo with the death of LaBianca. But, now I'm getting into the deep gutter of the hidden aspect of these crimes.
Yeah, there's a lot here, and we haven't even jumped to Vyek Fikowski. Now, I think, last time, I think we did discuss him, now that I'm thinking back a little bit, that they were trying to corner the market on
Correct.
MDMA.
Vyek Fikowski, through some Canadian and an American conglomerate of drug dealers. I know now, through a researcher named Nancy Farrell, who's done some very good research into this, and I want to give her credit for discovering this. She found out who the manufacturer of that MDMA was in Canada, and that MDA was to be distributed in Los Angeles by Roman Polanski's friend Vyek Fikowski, who was staying at Cielo Drive, and is probably the least remembered and least known of the victims. However, he is directly responsible for the murders. Whether willingly or unwillingly, he burnt Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian, who paid him they wanted to be the street distributors of MDMA, and they paid him for a large shipment of it. And for one reason or the other, which I cannot ascertain why, he failed to deliver. And when they went to Cielo Drive, ostensibly to get money to get Bobby Beausoleil a lawyer. Bobby Beausoleil, their friend, had just been arrested for the murder of Gary Hinman. Susan Atkins said, "How can we get money to get Bobby out?" And Linda Kasabian said, "I know some rich pigs in Beverly Hills who ripped us off. Let's go get them." And that's getting back to the significance of Susan Atkins in this crime. She was, it was as much her motive to get money as anything else. But yeah, you have to understand that this is really all about narcotics trafficking, and it's actually a very banal, everyday crime that happens all the time. And as I think I said in the last episode, to reiterate, it's very much like the Wonderland murders, the four on the floor murders. It's just scumbag drug dealers fighting each other over a cornering the market on a drug and a debt. So Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian were burned, and the horrible irony of it is that Linda Kasabian gave false testimony, blaming it all on Manson, of course not mentioning her direct role in this, and that she lived her life in freedom. The woman who instigated the crime was let go, and that's the cynicism of the American justice system and of Vincent Bugliosi.
Okay, so now to shift slightly over, Abigail Foler was the girlfriend of Vyek Fikowski, if I recall, and also an heiress herself of the Folgers coffee line or whatever.
Correct. Wojtek Fikowski was one of Roman Polanski's oldest friends. I've also researched this in Poland. I began doing my filming on this in February in Poland at the Łódź Film School, where Polanski met Fikowski. And that's very important to the background. This story, as I try to make clear in my film and in my book, it begins in Poland with the friendship of Roman Polanski and Wojtek Fikowski. It's not really the story of Charles Manson. Charles Manson is a figure in this saga, but he's not the central figure. So without Wojtek Fikowski, none of this happens. And Fikowski came to America along with Polanski's entourage of exiled Poles who wanted to escape communist tyranny and try to have a career on Polanski's back in Hollywood. And he just couldn't succeed. He was a ne'er-do-well who couldn't succeed in anything he tried to do. And he was a male gold digger who got involved with this very wealthy young woman, Abigail Foler, and she financed his amateur attempt at getting into drug dealing with fatal consequences. Another important aspect here is that Charlie told me in 2012 that he knew Abigail Foler since 1967 through Susan Atkins, who had met her at the Haight Street Free Clinic, which was a clinic that catered to the counterculture medical problems and drug problems and the rampant VD and gonorrhea problem that spread through that community. And so Charlie, without any ambiguity, said he had known Abigail Foler for 2 years before the murders. He said this very bitterly to me. I asked Abigail Foler for money and she wouldn't give me any. And he was still furiously angry in 2012 about a dispute from 1969. And I think that's a very significant factor in what happened. So just to make it clear, the victims and the killers knew each other. This was for people who are new to the subject, or maybe who have been exposed to false information. That's maybe the main takeaway that people need to understand to truly understand this thing. These people were drug dealers in the same milieu. They had the same friends. They were at the same orgies. They were taking the same drugs. They were not random strangers from two different social milieus. They were frenemies that, like many drug dealers, ended up in a fatal conflict.
Okay, and then when you're mentioning that and people not being strangers and all that, the one person who was thought to be an innocent bystander of sorts and taken out, I think you told me had even his own story that ties to another very famous murder in Hollywood, and that's Stephen Parent. Do you want to go into what his connections were?
Yeah, absolutely. I bring this up in passing in a few pages in my book, The Manson File. Stephen Parent, who people consider like the totally innocent bystander who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, who, if we believe the official narrative, went up at midnight to sell a alarm clock to William Garretson, the young caretaker of the house, who Rudy Altabelli, the owner of the house, while he was in Italy, had said, if you watch the house, you can live there and I'll pay you whatever smidgen he paid him. Supposedly he went there to sell an alarm clock to William Garretson. That is the bullshit story we've been told for decades. What you're not told is that Stephen Parent had more of a criminal record than anyone who was doing the murders that night, except for Susan Atkins. So he was a thief. In the police report about his activities, he was described as a homosexual sadist, which connects him very much to the Velvet Mafia gay underworld of Rudy Altobelli, who was the owner of the Cielo Drive house. And what's significant is what I learned, and William Belasco, and that's a name that you should keep in mind, was the agent of a very famous Hollywood star, and he revealed the story first several years ago, but I've confirmed it in a little more detail, and it's pretty shocking. Why was you? Do you know who William Garretson is? Do you remember? I know there's a lot of names to
No, not
remember
right
here.
off.
He was the young caretaker who survived the killing. You see pictures of him looking shocked and stunned after the murders, and he was briefly considered a suspect. He was in the guest house while the others were murdered in the other part of the property. One of the mysteries, how could he have survived? Why did they let him live? And as I think I mentioned in the last episode, Charlie and some unknown person or persons went back to the crime scene to rearrange it and to get rid of evidence. How could William Garretson have lived? And what I have determined is because Cary Grant, who's one of the most famous movie stars in history, was there that night with William Garretson, and Rudy Altobelli used William Garretson as a kind of boy toy for his closeted male movie star friends, and they were having sex on the property when the murders began. And Cary Grant and William Garretson heard the screams, and William Belasco, Cary Grant's agent, has testified to this. They ran out of the property. Cary Grant lived very near to Cielo Drive, and they went back while the murders were happening. Cary Grant never revealed that. His agent, William Belasco, spoke about it after his death. And what I later learned is that when the police arrived around 8 o'clock in the morning, a lot of celebrities and rock people and music people and movie stars already knew about the murders. And I get into that in the Manson file in my book. Even before it was reported to the public, word had spread on the rock and roll, drug and sex grapevine that these murders had happened. And a lot of covering up of it had already gone on. But by the time the police got there, they do a parameter search. They go through a crime scene very carefully, and they looked at all the cars that were parked there. And they checked, okay, this car is registered to Thomas Cummer, who was J. Sebring. This car is to Abigail Foler. And Sharon Tate, one of the reasons of the tragedy of her death is she was not supposed to be there that night, but her car was being repaired. And when they checked to see if the coast was clear, she had a replacement car, so they thought she wasn't there. And that probably was, unfortunately, this little trivial detail probably was one of the factors that led to the murder. So then what you don't know, what you've never been told, is that there is a black Rolls Royce parked there. You look at the pictures, you won't see it. But the police found a black Rolls Royce, and they traced it to the name of Archibald Leach. And Archibald Leach is the name of Cary Grant. And what the police decided, and this is what this case is all about, is Hollywood skullduggery. Hollywood and the film industry in cahoots with the mob and other malefactors covering up the true nature of what was going on. The police basically said, well, Mr. Grant's not really involved in this. Let's protect his reputation, and we can quietly move his vehicle back to his home. Nobody needs to know about it, and nobody has known about it. But if that was covered up, and if Cary Grant kept that a secret for that many decades, what else went on in that house? What else was hidden? What else don't we know? And a little epilogue to this Cary Grant business, and I think it's probably significant, though we may never know why. Cary Grant took an acid trip in 1964, before the hippie movement, in the living room of Cielo Drive, because he was already a friend of the owner, Rudy Altobelli, on his honeymoon with the actress Diane Cannon. They took acid in the very living room where the murders occurred several years later. And in 1967, Charlie Manson came to Universal Studios to record a record with a guy named Gary Stromberg for Uni Records. And he parked his bus in the parking lot in the spot reserved for Cary Grant at Universal Studios. And a friend of Cary Grant, an employee, came out of Cary Grant's cottage and told Charlie, "You can't park here." And Charlie admitted that he got into a homosexual relationship with this friend of Cary Grant. So that's three very major connections of Cary Grant to Cielo Drive. We know he was already there in 1964. His agent said he was there the night of the murders, and he had this tangential, 6 degrees of separation connection to Manson himself. So that's only one of the intriguing things that were covered up. And Charlie once said to me, and he said it, paraphrased it to other people who talked to him, if people knew what this was really about, it would be the biggest scandal in Hollywood history. Well, that would have been Cary Grant having sex with a young man during a murder, at Sharon Tate's house. That would be even more extreme and bizarre than the story we do know. And I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg of what really went on.
Wow. Well, that is probably a perfect point to stop on this round, because there's so many names and so much that you've just dropped for folks to chew on.
Right.
And
right. And I know it's a lot, and I know I'm presenting it in a very dense manner, but I would suggest that your viewers, look up these names themselves. Do the research yourself, and you'll see the connections. But I've been immersed in this for decades, and I see the background of it is very, very different than what you think it is. It isn't just a simple story of a crazy cult leader off on a ranch and the beautiful people up in Beverly Hills. It's a saga filled with hundreds of shady characters who are all intimately associated in a criminal network.
All right, well, perfect. And folks, Nick's book is actually coming out, I believe, now July 19th. And there's going to be a link in the description. And please comment below your thoughts on, questions you might have, any speculations. I don't expect everybody to agree with everything here. I have interviewed Tom O'Neill. Tom O'Neill has a very different take. Nick has a very different take. I've interviewed John Atack, who has a very different take about Jolly West than Tom O'Neill. I like to have different voices, and I definitely want to hear from all of you. And until next time, Nick, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you to all of you watching for your time and your consideration, and thank you, Eric, for inviting me. I will be leaving the land of the free and the home of the brave for a while, back to civilization, and when I return in August, we can get in touch again sometime, and there's many other topics we can discuss. So thank you for your hospitality today, and we will talk soon.